Well, hello, everybody, as people trickle into this event. Hopefully, how's everybody doing in the chat? Just chime in. Let us know that you're here. How's the session going? How's the day going? How's the whole festival going? And hopefully, everybody can hear me. Coming in all right. Yes, no, maybe so. Got 12 people in the chat so far. Oh, hey, there we go. Maybe there's a wonderful delay. Sometimes on Twitter, it's upwards of, or excuse me, Twitch, it's upwards of 30 seconds for delays. But welcome everybody to the second of three mental health AMAs. If you are not familiar with the abbreviation AMA, it is largely an internet. It's an internet term that I believe came out of Reddit, and it means ask me anything. And what that truly means, ask me anything. Yesterday, we had questions that ranged from how do we address certain aspects of mental health representation within games to what album can I not get enough of lately in terms of music. So this is really your opportunity to ask me whatever's on your mind. Now, a couple of caveats. One, my name is Dr. B. Everybody calls me that because my actual name is Raphael Boccamazzo. It's very long Italian, and at one point during my internships, the people I was working with looked at my name and just kind of went, no. So Dr. B just kind of stuck. I am a doctor of clinical psychology. I am not a practicing psychologist because I do nothing but policy and education these days as the clinical director of a mental health nonprofit called Take This. Now, Take This, when we started in 2012, was the very first mental health nonprofit to exclusively serve the game community. And our whole mission is to educate people within our games community, both on the industry and the consumer side, about mental health needs, destigmatize mental health, and also just provide as many educational resources as we can. Now, and especially in the last year, we have done copious amounts of trainings for game industry employees, managers, etc. We've done academic work such as the mental health state of the game industry white paper that we released in 2019. That's available on our website at takethis.org, and I can throw that in the chat if anybody's curious. But we also do some just fun stuff. I'm one of the hosts on a regular mental health talk show that's produced by our friends at Codename Entertainment, the makers of Idle Champions. Did that this morning, called Champions of Psychology. And I am also an expert on the applied use of role-playing games in clinical and learning settings. I enjoy getting to teach people about how role-playing games can be used as a clinical and learning device. And so with all that in mind, while I can't give any specific clinical advice, and if something is super like intricate, I might not be able to answer it. But if you look at the chat, and if you look at the top of the chat, you should see a Q&A button. And if you have any questions, and I hope you do, because otherwise we're just going to be we're going to sit here staring at each other for a while. Well, I'm going to be staring at, me, and you're staring at me. So we're all going to be looking at me for a while. And so throw in some questions. What do you want to ask in regards to mental health and games? What do you want to know? Do you want to know about better mental health representation? Do you want to know about the way certain clinicians and researchers are using games? Do you want to know if I actually enjoy long walks on the beach? It's kind of a yes or no question. I'll give you a freebie. It's a no. But this is really up to you. The whole format of today's session, today's AMA, Ask Me Anything, is really entirely up to you and what you would like to know. We already have and I will ask that as you type in your questions, please do not type in multi-part questions. If you cannot get it in one, try and condense as best as possible, because multi-part questions can get all skewed and jumbled as they're upvoted, downvoted, etc. So Okay, there we go. So we have our very first question. So in my experience, how often have I been involved in participatory design with a game directly for health benefits? I have not actually been involved in a game directly designed for mental health benefits. Now, I have been involved in game designs that have been thematically around mental health representation. One of them I can talk about is a game that's going to be coming out, I believe, later this year from a Canadian independent company, Canadian independent game studio called Two Dogs, and the game is called Destiny's Sword. And Destiny's Sword is really interesting in that they incorporate what they're calling their insight engine into an MMO squad-based military game, where between the missions you have to have interpersonal interactions that can impact the mental wellness of your platoon, your squad members, in such a way that it directly impacts their in-game performance. So optimizing your squad's mental wellness on, I believe, 8 different domains, becomes itself a part of the game. And I have to say that Two Dogs did a really stellar job in bringing us and other mental health professionals into the fold as part of the design process. I know our community manager, Dr. Kelly Dunlap, gave a great short talk yesterday on the main stage on ethical design around mental health in games. And one of the things that I know Dr. Dunlap advocates, and I do too, is if you have any sort of mental health themes within your games, bring experts, subject matter experts in as soon as possible. Don't bring us in when the game is 90% complete and you can't do anything about it. Bring us in at the inception. Keep us there. Check with us throughout the process. And incidentally, that's something that Take This does. And so Two Dogs did a really good job in keeping us involved in most steps of the process and bringing us in as early as possible. So that was one example. Another one, and I don't exactly know how it's going to turn out because I don't know what changes they made, but Psychonauts 2, which is a mental health themed game done by Double Fine Productions that Xbox is going to be releasing this August, I believe. That we were involved in some of the consultation on that. But like I said, I'm going to be curious to see what changes they've made based on our feedback, and it's going to be kind of a fun discovery process. Additionally, beyond that, I am one of the co-authors of a best-selling mental health themed charity module for Dungeons and Dragons called Gardens of Fog. And the creation process of that was involved bringing in me as a mental health expert who has a fair amount of experience with Dungeons and Dragons, as well as 2 writers who have an incredible amount of experience with Dungeons and Dragons and also have some mental health experience. So between the 3 of us, we ended up creating a mental health themed charity module that hopefully ends up teaching a couple of things about empathy and acceptance of mental health challenges as well. So yeah, hopefully, Michael, that gives you a little bit of information on your first question. And as a reminder for those of you who have just joined us, if you have a question, and I really hope you do, because this is an Ask Me Anything, this is an AMA, your questions dictate the structure and direction of this session, whether it's about mental health directly, whether it's about games, whether it's about whatever, whether it's about my favorite flavor of ice cream. Go ahead and look at the top of the chat where it says Q&A and type in your questions. And let's see here. Got another question from Michael. Boy, that's awesome. What barriers as a clinician do you see in implementing games for health into day-to-day life? Okay, so just to clarify a couple of things. One, I am not actively a clinician these days. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, I am clinically trained. I may do clinical work in the future, but I am not at this time a licensed independent provider. I do policy and education exclusively these days. But that being said, one of the things back in the days when I trained working with people, and based on the talks I have with friends who are and colleagues who are active clinicians, what barriers do I see in implementing games for health into day-to-day life? Well, a couple of things. One, there is a reticence on the part of a lot of healthcare providers and parents to bring in electronic games. There still exists a lot of moral panic that's largely unfounded around the idea of video games as a whole. And if you think about the history of any new technology, there has been moral panic around it. I mean, in the 1980s to the early 1990s, we had the moral panic around Dungeons and Dragons associated with the Satanic Panic. If you go back earlier than that, I mean, Elvis could not be shown from the waist down on Ed Sullivan. 1954, we had the book Seduction of the Innocents about the comic book industry in the United States. Go earlier than that, pinball was going to be the downfall of civilization. I believe Plato even made some reference to written language weakening the memories of the youths. So really, every time we have something new, we have people who are clutching their pearls and so forth. And that has not abated as far as video games go. And so I think there is an attitude around gaming as not being valuable, not being real, not being a good thing to do. And so additionally, we also run into the barrier of clinicians and researchers not being gamers. I mentioned already Dr. Kelly Dunlap, who's both our community manager at Take This and a practicing clinical psychologist, and also has an additional master's degree in game design. Kelly is the most qualified person in the world to talk about what she talks about, because as far as I know, she's the only person in the world who is a practicing clinical psychologist who also has a master's degree in game design and development. And so she is a rarity within both the mental health and the research field. And so another barrier that I've seen to implementing games for health into day-to-day life is that a lot of the games designed by researchers are boring. They're terrible to play. They're interesting to learn, but they're not fun. And they become a form of work in and of themselves. And I'm trying to think of any examples that might exist of something that's both an interesting learning game as well as a game that specifically teaches skills. And I'm coming up blank. So yeah, not only do we have that moral panic around games, but also there's, a lot of the games that are designed by clinicians are not really particular, and researchers are not really good games. And the games that are a lot of games designed by game devs, well, they don't necessarily have the expertise to tell mental health stories, unless it's their story, or teach skills in the same nuanced manner that a researcher would. So I think researchers and experienced game devs need to get together, and also with a third party who is an effective science communicator, because that is something that we don't emphasize enough, is the skill set involved in effectively communicating science. A lot of researchers that I've talked to, I've run into, they're so talented and they're so good at knowing all the ins and outs and the do's and the don'ts about their particular topic and even other people's topic, because they're just immersed in just inundated by all of this sciencey stuff. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those people who are experts with that are good at communicating that stuff to people who know nothing about it. And so ideally, I would love to see games for health designed by, three different groups of people. One who knows the science, one who knows the games, and one who can basically be the mediator between them to effectively communicate the topics. So that's a really, really good question. Let's see here. Let's go into some other questions. Let's see. Do we think let's see, do I think there should be more funding towards using gaming as a part of treatments and programs? Um, I mean, it depends. I mean, Autumn, this is a really interesting question. I don't want to say that gaming is a thing like anything else. Okay. Let's replace that with any other hobby. Do I think there should be more funding towards using books as a part of treatments or programs? Do I think there should be more funding towards using football, either American or global, as part of treatments and programs? I think there's a lot of creativity that can be done with any format of delivery for interventions if you know that delivery system well enough. Now, one of the advantages to games is portability. Like, you know, I can carry it on my phone. So that's a serious advantage to a great game like that. But I think it depends. I think there should be more. I think there should be more research done on the effectiveness of using games as an intervention and or delivery system, especially well-designed games. Problem being that research is slow and technology isn't. And that's another barrier that we see. Like, as an example, I had a friend in grad school who she designed a really interesting personality inventory that she was able to she was able to actually norm this thing and validate it. It was a personality inventory based on cell phone preferences, which was really interesting. The faculty was just so excited about this because it was so interesting. It had never been done as far as they know. And the problem was, by the time she finished all the research on this and she was ready to do her dissertation, nobody was using those phones anymore. And so, the pacing of technology versus research becomes a barrier in and of itself. But nevertheless, I would really love to see more generalized research on the effectiveness of electronic games in therapeutic intervention settings. So that's a really interesting question, Autumn. Let's see here. What was the name of that D&D module again? Can you provide a link? I will. Oh, hey, cool. Gardens of Fog. There it is in the DMs Guild. And these are great questions, folks. Please keep hitting me with them. Heather, a game that most strongly affected me in any fashion the most and why? Oh, wow. Okay. That's a really interesting question. What game that most strongly affected me in any sense? I'm going to go for a relatively recent example in the last couple of years, and I'm going to bring up What Remains of Edith Finch. Now, aside from the fact that What Remains of Edith Finch is a incredible, just graphically incredible game, it's largely a linear storytelling game where you are the protagonist, Edith Finch, and you are returning to your ancestral home to examine. It's a real downer of a game. Just to warn you, okay. And just content warnings. We're probably going to be getting into some discussions of some very grim mental health based themes. So if you need to remove yourself from the chat for your own mental health, or you have a strong reaction to any mental health themes, suicide, anything like that, then take a break. You take care of you. Come back if you're feeling it. But What Remains of Edith Finch is a game about grief and loss, and it's a beautiful, beautiful storytelling game where different struggles, mental health and otherwise, are represented by very different mechanics artistically in the game. And one of the things I loved about What Remains of Edith Finch is that they didn't try and give some sort of literal definitive representation of any one mental health condition. There's one point where you're seeing things from the perspective of a now deceased ancestor, and or a family member, and it's clear based on the mechanics that they use that the family member is struggling with symptoms of psychosis. At least I thought it was pretty clear. But they don't try and give any sort of stereotypical portrayal of schizophrenia, like or anything like that. They just show you an artistic rendition of the experiences from that person's perspective, and it was incredibly effective. But what we have at the end of the game, I'm not going to spoil too much. Okay, I'm not going to, because I would. It's a powerful story. It's a really powerful story. But at the end of the game, we get this amazing juxtaposition of both tragedy and hope, which I love hopeful games. I love hopeful stories because the world's got enough tragedy in it. I don't want to see more tragedy. I want to see people be resilient. I want to see people triumph against that tragedy. Because the world's hard enough. And it was an absolutely brilliant and touching juxtaposition of tragedy and hope. In a way, I cried. I'm a crier, but I cried hard at the end of that because it was just so tragic and so beautiful, that game, and what remains of Edith Finch. I'll also, in terms of game that most strongly affected me in any fashion, I want to also bring in a tabletop analog. And one of this one's a little bit more circumlocucious. One of the things I'm very public about, and I mentioned this yesterday, is I'm autistic. I was not diagnosed until I was 35. And I got heavily involved in tabletop role-playing games starting around the age of 15. So I had 20 years between me getting diagnosed. Getting diagnosed versus my my engagement in tabletop RPGs. What I realized is that the safe framework and the largely open framework of tabletop RPGs, especially when I was playing with trusted friends, and it allowed me to explore idealized patterns of social behavior that I wanted to see in myself. The characters that I would always create in these in these tabletop RPGs were suave. They were charming. They had way more social awareness than I ever did, and probably still do, or still don't. Yeah, something like that. You're with me, hopefully. But what I realized in my early 20s is that this framework, the safe framework of being able to physically act out these characters with my friends in a trusting environment that's relatively free of consequences for in-game behavior. I could mess up, I could try again. If I did something particularly well, the whole group, it was a team building thing on top of that. And I realized in my early 20s that what I was doing was I was rehearsing social scripts that I wanted to see in myself, and that if my character in Dungeons and Dragons or Star Wars, I mean, I love Star Wars, I can play a Jedi, and I realized that wasn't just my character, that had to come from me, that had to come from somewhere within. And then I realized I could start externalizing that if these charming characters came from me in the game, then it was more anxiety provoking because of course there's real life consequences. But I could learn from that. And now, just ironically, given the fact that I literally have a social disability when it comes to my autism, I am giving a talk in 2 months on how to network effectively in person, because apparently me having to learn things manually on how to people has given me some advantages that other people don't necessarily have, and they would like to ask me questions about that, which still just baffles the crud out of me. But that in a lot of respects, I have Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop RPGs to thank for that, because they gave me a framework in which to practice this. And incidentally, for those of you who are not necessarily as familiar with some of the very little, but some academic research that exists on tabletop RPGs, as far as I know, the first research that was done on that was published in 1983 by a guy named Gary Allen Fine out of the University of Chicago, and he published a book called Shared Fantasy, where he did this epistemological study of a fantasy role-playing group in the Twin Cities area. He was, inundated in the group for a year and a half. And one of the things that he was rallying against as he talked about fantasy role-playing games in those days, it was the idea, the common moral panic-based criticism that games loosen your grip on reality. And that there were popular narratives about people becoming psychotic and harming other people. Well, boy, let's get seriously. Can y'all clap for the Games for Change admin and chat? They are just on it with, I'm mentioning something and we're getting a link. This is fantastic. So one of the things that Gary Allen Fine talked about in his year and a half long study being a part of these fantasy role-playing groups is that in order to effectively play these games, you actually had to have a more concrete perspective of reality. And he used something called frame analysis to discuss how people move within different frames of reality for playing the games. And in frame one, he talked about, and by the way, tell me to stop if I'm getting way too technical on this, because this is my area of interest. I'm like, oh, well, we can talk about frame analysis. This is fun. So what he talked about in this is frame one was the sort of surface level reality where everybody's at the table and playing the game together. Frame two was the structure of the game itself, the rules of the game. So if I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons, I have to know when to slide from frame one, talking to the other players. can you pass the Cheetos? To where's the Mountain Dew? An inside joke for those of you who are nerds. But I slide from where's the Mountain Dew to the actual structure of the game rules itself. And then frame three, which is where we get in, I think it's interesting, is that the perspective of the in-game character. And ostensibly, the in-game character should not have the same knowledge base as the player itself. When we have frame one and frame three crossover, that's what's called metagaming. But Gary Allen Fine posited that in order to effectively play games like this, you have to be able to fluidly slide between these different frames of reality in order to play the game. And he posited that this actually helps people's grip on reality to be able to effectively do this. Or I would say, if you're not effectively able to do that, you sort of self-select out of the group. And so this is part of the reason I love tabletop role-playing games, because within those particular frames, especially if you add a fourth frame that Dr. Megan Connell and I added to our theoretical overview of this stuff, that you can have a learning/clinical frame and slide between all of them. But anyway, I love that it gives you a safe framework to explore yourself, live out fantasies, et cetera, that video games can as well. It's just that you don't have necessarily the same level of autonomy in video games. You can only go to the limits of their programming. So yeah, that's my very circumlocucious answer to what game most strongly affected me in any fashion. So thank you, Heather. Let's see, Monica, with the release of Doki Doki Literature Club Plus game, what do you think is the responsibility of game developers when it comes to portrayals of mental health topics in video games? Monica, I am only familiar with Doki Doki Literature Club in an extremely cursory sense. I am not quite as I've never actually played it, but I do know that it does touch on mental health themes. But to go, and they've actually, the fan base has been very supportive of Take This, and we, heart them in a school appropriate way. But what I would say in terms of as a more overarching and aspirational answer, I'm going to steal a line from Kelly Dunlap, from Dr. Dunlap. Do no harm. You know, there's an expression in comedy called punching down. And what punching down is where, if we think about social power dynamic, Doki Doki Literature Club has mental health subjects like suicide and depression. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, like any form of media, there are ways of sensitively dealing with that, and there are ways of doing so in a marginalizing way, and that's where we're talking about this whole punching down concept. And so, in comedy, you talk of punching down, which means if you have a social power dynamic and there's somebody who is kind of lower than you within the social hierarchy for whatever reason, making fun of them is punching down. And I think another people, I've heard other people call that bullying, because it is. It's essentially, if you're equals and there's a social contract between you that there are equals and you can make fun of each other, that's one thing. That's a mutually agreed upon social contract. So, but if you take somebody or a group of people who's already marginalized and you are an outsider and you're giving a stereotypical and largely marginalizing portrayal of that group, whether that's, well, really any group whatsoever, I can certainly talk about some of the portrayal of autism in media that I cannot stand, because it's stigmatizing. So as an overarching concept within the responsibility of all portrayals of mental health, not only in games, but in movies and books and music, I think the responsibility is to educate oneself on the realities of the lived experience of those whom you are portraying, and to represent them in an honest and non-stigmatizing fashion. Now, that's a really difficult thing when it's not your story. Now, and so if you choose to tell a story that is not your own, then bring on people who can guide you from the get-go. There are certainly plenty of examples. I try not to highlight bad examples, because I try to highlight good examples, because I want to prop up the people who are doing it well. And a good example of that has largely become the gold standard in how to approach it was Ninja Theory's game Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. It is a game, it's a very dark, adult-themed game that deals with loss and psychosis. And it's done in a really, Game for Change admin is just on it. Thank you. So Hellblade really does a fantastic example of portraying psychotic symptoms in a largely non-stigmatizing manner. And they do this through the protagonist, who is an 8th century Pict woman who is traveling through the underworld to find the soul of her dead lover. Now, she experiences extraperceptory experiences that it's been a while since I've learned it, so are culturally framed. But the cool thing about the way they did this is that the team, one, hired an expert psychiatrist from, I believe, Dr. Paul Fletcher is at Oxford. I need to check. But either way, Dr. Paul Fletcher is an expert psychiatrist and neuroimaging specialist. And Dr. Fletcher and the Ninja Theory team gathered an entire focus group of people who dealt with various symptoms of psychosis and brought them into the development process to ask them questions, to get their feedback on what was being done. And it was not a one-time thing. And I believe, if I recall this correctly, when I talked to Dr. Fletcher a couple years ago, the feedback from the group was the original ending did not portray their situation in a non-stigmatizing light, or it was not a good ending for whatever reason. I was not there. You're getting this secondhand. And they changed it based on the feedback of the group that they were working with, the people whom they were working with. And what was cool about it is that some people, when they played Hellblade, said, this is not my experience of psychosis. And some people are like, oh my God, this is my experience of psychosis. And they show it to their families. And one of the things that they did well is they didn't try to make a definitive version of any diagnosis, which is just not possible if you think about it. The example I like to bring up is depression. Within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental, the DSM that the American Psychiatric Association puts out, the Bible according to the APA, there are 9 symptoms of depression of which you must meet 5 or more. And I believe, based on something somebody told me in one of my panels at one point, there are something like 54,000 possible variations of those 9 symptoms of which you must meet 5 or more. And that's depression. So if there are literally thousands of possible variations, you're not going to have one definitive representation. And so that's something that I think Hellblade did a really good job in, as they were giving an experience based on what people gave them as feedback. Who had those experiences. So yeah, I think it's the responsibility of, when you're telling somebody else's story, if you're choosing to tell somebody else's story, whether it's movies, video games, music, whatever, you get the ongoing input of the people whose stories you are telling. That is just an important thing. You want to tell a story about autism and you're not autistic, get input along the entire path from people who are, not just one person, but people. Because my autism is not my friend's autism. And so we're going to have very different experiences for a variety of intersectional reasons, and symptomatic reasons. So yeah, that's where I think the responsibility lies. Like, and actually I had an interview, an informational interview with a reporter a couple weeks ago, who approached me with concerns about how much more evocative video games are starting to be in terms of the stories that they're telling. They're dealing with things like mental health. They're dealing with things like systemic oppression in the United States. They're dealing with a lot of different, very nuanced and adult themes. And this reporter was worried about, or at least seemingly worried, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they gave me the impression that they were worried about the effect that dealing with these topics can have on the people who are playing the games. And I thought about it for a little bit. And video games are roughly 60 years old. Okay, depending on what you want to argue was the very first video game. There was a game that was done on the oscilloscope that was flying around space. 60 years is a long time for any Space War. Thank you, Roger. Thank you. And the 60 years is a long time for any form of media to evolve. And I thought about it for a moment, and I thought about the early cinematography work of Georges Méliès. If you've ever seen the very famous image of the black and white moon with a big rocket bullet stuck in its eye, that is from the Journey to the Moon that Georges Méliès did in, I believe, 1902. 60 years after that, we had The Manchurian Candidate with Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury and Janet Leigh. And The Manchurian Candidate was dealing with themes of psychological warfare, communism, conformity, political intrigue. That is a lot of nuance to be contained, to go from a trip to the moon. Thank you, admin, again. So on it. To the Manchurian Candidate. But even in half that time, you've got Casablanca, which remains just a stellar movie. And so, in the 60 years that video games have evolved, I would fully expect them to be telling more nuanced stories in the same way that any form of media would. If I look at comic books from 60 years ago, X-Men #1 was 58 years ago. And oh God, X-Men #1 was 58 years ago in 1963. And I expect the stories to be very different today. And so video games are going to evolve just like any form of media will, to tell more nuanced stories as they build upon their predecessors. Okay, thank you, Monica. Boy, that was a long-winded answer or series of answers, wasn't it? Nicole, dark patterns are used in some game designs to create compelling experiences. Which powerful non-dark loops do you think are underused in today's designs, and what would you recommend using? I would recommend you talk to Dr. Dunlap, is what I would recommend, Nicole. That is so out of my wheelhouse. I am not a game designer. I would love to be able to actually, two names to consider. Dr. Dunlap is a really good person to talk to about game design. Or read their work on game design, but also Dr. Rachel Cowart, who is Take This's research director. And Rachel Cowart has done a number of books on both I believe dark participation, as well as dark patterns. And so Dr. Cowart's books are the Video Game Debate 1, the Video Game Debate 2. And I believe, yep, thank you, admin. Amazing. Dr. Cowart's books have covered a variety of different things, and I believe that Dr. Cowart and Dr. Dunlap are collaborating on something in that realm. If I could multitask, I would go over to the Take This Slack and ask them right now, but yay for poor working memory. But yeah, those are some, Dr. Cowart and Dr. Dunlap are definitely two people to be following. If y'all aren't, by the way, if y'all aren't on Twitter, absolutely, a lot of the really up to date people within video game research are on Twitter. So if for nothing else, get on Twitter to follow folks like Dr. Dunlap, Dr. Cowart, Take This org, me if you feel like it. I mostly rant about Dungeons and Dragons and talk about the talks I'm about to give. But so that's not my area of expertise, Nicole, but a really good question. Okay, Evan, I have been in treatment for PTSD and am currently working on a game that deals with shell shock in World War I. How do I balance my lived experience, the experience of others, and a clinical approach? Well, Evan, first of all, thank you for being so vulnerable and bringing that up. That is that's not easy to talk about that stuff, even still. As far as balancing a clinical approach and the experience of others and all that one, my go-to is always to work with a licensed clinician who understands your need and all of your needs. Everybody's needs are, of course, very different. And I think it would be both arrogant and a little irresponsible of me to tell you how to balance your needs. If you're working with a clinician right now, excellent. No, it is not easy, Evan, to be open and reduce that stigma. It is absolutely not. I'm shocked how often people thank me for even mentioning that I'm autistic. And part of me just kind of wants to say, well, it's my job to be a mental health advocate. So, but there's also there's a very real understanding that this stuff is still so stigmatized. So, yeah, I would say work with your clinician to figure out where that balance is between that the lived experience, the experience of others, because especially when you're wading through your own mental muck, so to speak, it's hard to know where that line can be between your needs and other people's needs, especially if you're feeling at all emotionally reactive. And I say that from both personal and professional experience. As part of my autism, I struggle with chronic depression, and when that's kicking my butt, I have a hard time understanding where I end and somebody else begins sometimes, and giving to others is kind of my default mode. So yeah, balancing that is something to work with your clinician on. Let's see here. People with different neurotypes might find different. People with different neurotypes might find very different things problematic. What are my takes on content warnings in that regards? Well, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by neurotypes, because that's a word that's become so utilized by so many people that it depends on who's using it. But I can give you, John, I can give you um, my opinion on content warnings. Content warnings are consumer friendly. Content warnings are awesome. It's the same. It's just like a rating system at the movies. If I'm expecting Little Mermaid and I get Rambo, I'm going to be shocked based on my expectations. Um, the you know I kind of want to know a synopsis of what I'm about to pay money to go to see. And especially if we're understanding that subject matters can have, um, people can be sensitive or even literally reactive. And the word trigger has become really overused within the context of the general population. A lot of people don't even know what it actually means. They just think it means emotional reactivity, when it's really much more significant than that. And so things that can literally trigger people. I come from a household of a lot of trauma. My father is my Vietnam vet father is largely the reason I do what I do. And if I'm about to watch something with my dad, like I'll actually give an example that I know he wouldn't mind me sharing. Um, this was way back when I was just getting into grad school, and I didn't have the nuanced understanding of this stuff that I do now. Not that I'm a master of it. I mean, I'm always learning and I will get things wrong, but I'm more experienced in these topic matters than I was, 14 years ago. One hopes. And he was starting to open up to me about some of his experiences because I was learning in more detail. I had a very trauma oriented program that I studied in, and we were just talking about the stuff I was learning because he, was really curious. And we got to talking about portrayals of different experiences in media, which is something he and I also have in common. If you haven't figured it out by now, I love media. Most people don't bring up Georges Méliès. And I brought up the topic of Billy Joel. And a lot of people, when they think of Billy Joel, they think of, Piano Man, longest time, kind of bubblegum pop. Um, so, but he's also dealt with some more nuanced things like, let's see, scenes from an Italian restaurant. It's almost a little operetta within a 7-minute song. And we talked about Goodnight Saigon, a narrative forward song that he wrote about Vietnam. I did not realize that the sound of the helicopter slowly coming in was going to give my father such an intense flashback that he could barely hold. I was in the car. He could barely hold it together to tell me to turn it off. And I think he could have, if I had known, or if I had the wherewithal to realize this could have been a literal trigger for him, I could have informed him ahead of the time, and maybe he could have decided at that point, I want to experience this. I don't have the mental resources to experience this right now, but he could come back to it if he wants. Giving people the choice to engage in something or disengage from something is, I think, incredibly consumer friendly. And so, in terms of offering content warnings, trigger warnings, I'm all for it. I'm all for it because people can decide, I want to do this or I don't. Maybe I'm not in a good, for the last year, I definitely haven't wanted to watch hardcore dramas. I want to laugh. And if there's themes of pandemic within a movie, I'm just gonna be like, nope, I live that. So I love content warnings. It's so great. Let's see. Best and worst portrayal of autism in media, in my opinion. Okay. That's a good question. I'm gonna focus on the good ones because I think there's a lot of bad ones. There's a lot of bad ones. And I instead want to focus on who has done it well. And as much as I hate to bring up this example because of a lot of controversy around the creator, the movie Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, they don't overtly say that the hero, Newt Scamander, is autistic. But that's a thing. In a lot of cases with autistic characters, it's the autism community that sort of adopts that character. They don't overtly say this character is autistic. But Newt Scamander did not make eye contact with people hardly ever. He had an idiosyncratic understanding of the social norms around him. He had some repetitive stereotyped movements, which I interpreted as stims. Additionally, he had an incredibly intensive focus on one subject that he made his entire career. But the cool thing about that portrayal was that he was not an ancillary character. He was the hero. And two, um, and two, he is accepted by the other people within that community. And I watched that on a plane coming home from, I think, PAX East, and I started I started sobbing just openly on that plane because this is an autistic hero and he got the girl. Okay, he was a romantic hero. And so here we have somebody who is clearly different from the rest of his culture. And when they brought it up, it was in not in a judgmental way. It was often just a, dude, you're a little different. And it's like, I know. And they were like, okay, cool. And that was it. That was it. He still was heroic. He still was he was still he was still heroic and all a fleshed out character, and I want to see that more. It's a little bit of a different example, but Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation, I think there's a little controversy around that because, I mean, obviously Data's an android and Data wants to be different than he is. And a lot of the neurodiversity movement is around the idea that we are not a broken version of normal. We're on a different operating system. I like to say that we're Linux in a Windows world. And, if you were a Linux outnumbered by Windows 50-1 and you were told to basically be a Windows PC when you're not, you're going to look pretty broken. And but Data in Star Trek: The Next Generation is accepted and loved for who he is. And who he wants to be, regardless of what that is. So those are some great ways of portraying characters who are different. So yeah, those are some good portrayals, I think, of autism. Newt Scamander, despite how much the J.K. Rowling and her ongoing shenanigans, it's still probably the best portrayal that I can think of when it comes to autism, even though Chris, I'm still going to get to your question, because this is an AMA. This is an Ask Me Anything. What is my proudest gaming achievement to date? We can, I will say that, like any good story, you have to have a pacing, you have to have a tempo, you have to have oscillations between things. In good drama, there are moments of humor. In good comedies, there's moments of tension. And we got to have an alleviation of things sometimes. And so let's talk about my proudest gaming achievement to date. And I'm going to continue talking about this until I can figure out what my proudest gaming achievement to date actually is. Because I've been gaming for a long time, and I'm not sure if I've ever really thought about my proudest gaming achievement. You know what? I'm going to say it's gaming adjacent. It's gaming adjacent. It's not directly related to games itself. Take This has been doing what we do for almost 9 years now. And I've been involved with Take This officially for almost 6. It'll be 6 years. It'll be 6 years this December. And we have made inroads enough within the game community. And this is so narcissistic, but I'm going to say it anyway. Within the game community, and have been outspoken enough that our dear friends at Wormwood Gaming named some gemstone dice after me. I was so pumped, and I called my mom and I was like, "Mom, I've got dice named after me." And it was just so cool to see how excited people were to buy gemstone dice that supported Take This's mental health mission. These were people who were merging gaming and mental health, and they wanted to support it. And the dice were named after me. They were 6-sided dice, Dr. B6s. I ordered like 10 of them because they were a randomized thing. You didn't know which one you were going to get. So that was both, Chris, that was both incredibly thrilling. Unfortunately, Vivian, they are no longer available. It was a one-time thing. However, if you want to support Take This's mental health mission, you can. Yeah, right. It is meta. If you want to support Take This's mental health mission, what you can do is actually you can go to Wormwood Gaming and you can get one of our boxes of hope, which are really wonderful. I used to give these to my clients. They are a randomized. I didn't realize this was going to turn into a promotional thing. Randomized shields in one of 90 different woods. I used to give these as transitional objects to my clients when I worked with people, as a reminder that they could carry with them, that they could always come back, that there was somebody in their corner. And thank you, admin. Additionally, if you go to takethis.org and you look at our merch page, our friends at Beetle and Grimm's made something called the Shield of Faith, which fun story around that I won't get into because we don't have time, but that was the first time I met Matthew Lillard, the actor, who also is one of the co-owners and founders of a fantastic tabletop accessory company called Beetles and Grimm. And and Matt and I they hit it off and we talked, and they decided to make a charity item for us that's a badge, a shield, and so forth. But yeah, that's probably my proudest achievement, is just getting people to care that within the gaming sphere. This is going to be the last question I take because we have 1 minute. When taking an artistic figurative approach to mental health, to mental illness, it can become so artsy that it loses any impact and misses the mark entirely. How can that be avoiding? Playtesting. You just have people look at your work on an ongoing basis, and getting called up for asking about dice. So playtesting, ongoing playtesting is an amazing tool, because, like some of my screenwriter friends say, if you have to explain it, you didn't get the message across. So that's my quick answer to that one. But thank you, everybody, for being here. We're going to have one more of these AMAs tomorrow, and yeah, at 2:30 to 3:30 Eastern time. So I will be on here relatively early for me over here in Seattle. And I hope to see you there. And what at PM. I'm not waking up at AM. That 2:30 AM happens to other people. But yeah, so thank you all for being here. Thank you for all these amazing questions. Thank you for those of you who are new to this one. Thank you for those who have come back. Make sure to check out Take This at takethis.org. Follow us on all the social medias at takethis.org, and please enjoy the rest of Games for Change. Bye, everyone.